Studio Europa, per sentirsi in Europa. Un programma a cura della Commissione Europea, rappresentanza in Italia.
Presidente Higgins, vorrei affrontare un
Mr. President, we will now talk about your work as a poet. But before we actually ask you to read one poem, I would like to ask you, you have said in the past that poetry in its broadest sense is the only way to move forward in challenged times. Why is that?
Well, it wasn't I who actually said it, but in times of despair, it is to poetry we must turn in our pursuit of truth. Poetry of its nature is a distilling process. It concentrates on the essential. And in that way, there is nothing wasted. But it also tries to get to the truth of pain as well as the truth of imagination. Always open. So it is not carrying the burden of certainties that have been proved false. In the poem I will read now, this is a poem about making a fire from turf, of watching the spark make a flame, and how, if you like, it may or may not be successful. I wrote this poem for a very important philosopher who is the abbot of the Benedictine order in Glenstool, Mark Patrick Hedeman. Okay. The Truth of Poetry, for Mark Patrick Hedeman. In its beginning, the truth of poetry is a light sheltered, yet no mere spark of a moment, exhausted, ephemeral. The truth of poetry flickers as the fire takes. Truth-making feeds the flames that blaze again, becomes beautiful in the light, and in the fire is seen for a moment possibility, unquenchable, transformed, reborn out of time, out of decay. As the flames rise, the turf expires. Nor yet is this an answer. Such fire as truth requires is from a source inexhaustible. Such fire as would make of hope a possibility made inevitable, awaits the lightning. Then let us pray for those who hope that from the raking of the ashes and the placing of the seeds for a new fire and a new day in eternal renewal, such a fire may come as lets them see, even for a while, the fragile truth of poetry revealed. Enough for the going on.
Grazie, Presidente.
Mr. President, poetry is for you a way of living, and it's also something that has informed your life as a politician. In fact, it has never been too clear whether it was the politician in you that influenced the poet or whether it was the other way around. So why this very strong union between those two sides of life, of your life? And does the poet, or the politician, sorry, in you ever betray the poet in you?
I think that I have not been interested in making the division between the world of the private and the world of the public. There are poets who have struggled with this. It is very clear that in the case of W.B. Yeats, for example, that he has a politically engaged period. It's also clear that he leaves it and goes back to a personal reflection in the poems. In my case, it was about language. I have always been speaking in public, and it is maybe the most audacious part of my own work, that I prefer performed work to the weary work of producing lines on a page. My 4 books have sought to address the crisis of living, particularly for me early on, at a time when I had both a utopian vision but also a vision that the world could be changed. Not for myself, but for many people in many different circumstances. Sometimes I took a great deal of the agony of others into myself to see how it would come out in language. And in some of my poems too, I deal with themes that I would call themes of intimacy. And I think people reading my poems will see these themes of intimacy are given a greater centrality than what I would call themes of sexuality in the modern period. I'm interested in pushing the question deeper, questions of relationship and loss and love. Beyond the eye there is a golden space, a shared place not in any sky, no fantasy escape. And getting there requires a frightening journey through the gaze of the other. To see your seed in every child's eye, and feel that every wrinkle in a worn hand was your own skin gone dry, requires a journey that few may take. For once begun, the terrifying gaze requires the journey be complete. That look in all the children's eyes will start a fire in the heart that no private words or gesture of limb or lip can quench. In the first stumbling, you may be helped by allies for a part of that journey through the first challenge. But alone you must make it through the fire where the death of the eye is required, to the blinding light where unsteady and weak you appear bent near broken. But all hands combine in the space of light and beckon, all human, not one eye, but occupants of a shared space where at last all hearts can beat together, that space of no difference beyond the eye, where life no longer defies death and a great unity brings peace with all creation, defiled no longer by the eye.
Farò un'ultima domanda perché lei ha parlato a giusto titolo di intimità, di
I will ask one last question about poetry. You mentioned the importance of intimacy as opposed to sexuality in some of your poems. Poetry is perhaps above all an affair of the heart, as opposed to the tyranny of materialism and of the mind. What is the importance of love in your poetry?
I think that it is very important to define love in terms of what is shared. It requires a consideration that is beyond the senses at a period of one's life that is full of energy. There is the excitement of love delivered through energy. And there is a celebration of what might be erotic pleasure delivered through sexuality. But a consideration of love involves an element of what is shared through the life cycle. But also, I think, it is important to draw distinctions between the circumstances of love and the requirements of sexuality. There are people who have shared spaces together at extraordinary moments of joy and terror. And these forms of intimacy are in poetry in several different ways. It makes of love not something exclusive, but something very important. So therefore, when people, brothers and sisters and friends and so forth, recall a sense of place and space, it may have been invested with love. My poem Inadequacy addresses this to some extent. Inadequacy. To be near, to be close, to hold, to touch, to care, to lie against in iceberg times, enough for the breaking of a heart that asked mutely about sufficiency of love.
So thank you very much for this interview.